Only one system in the human body is different in the male and female, the reproductive system. The human species, like all other forms of life, must reproduce to continue its existence on our planet. Like many complex plants and animals, the human species requires two different reproductive systems for reproduction.
When you're born, all your body systems are working, some more effectively than others. But your reproductive system isn't ready yet to do its main job. Your ability to reproduce requires a maturing of your reproductive system.
The time of life when this maturing begins is called puberty. The age when it happens is different in different people, but the way it happens is pretty much the same in everyone. For males, this is the time when our voices get lower, our shoulders get broader, hips narrower, body hairier.
And women take on the more typical female shape. Our breasts develop, our hips get broader, and in both male and female, the organs of the reproductive system mature.
The main function of the organs of the two different reproductive systems is to produce two kinds of cells and bring them together. An egg cell from the female, a sperm cell from the male. The production of these cells is the beginning of the first stage of the reproduction process. Let's start with the reproductive system of the female.
Our primary sex organs are the ovaries. Here, in this pair of small organs, only about 3 centimeters long, slightly more than an inch, the development of egg cells takes place. All the egg cells we will ever have, several 100,000 of them, are in our ovaries from birth. But the cells don't begin maturing until puberty. This usually happens somewhere between the ages of 10 and 14. The pituitary gland at the base of the brain begins sending hormones about once a month through the blood to our ovaries. Stimulated by these hormones, the ovaries put out hormones of their own. One kind, the estrogens, causes the physical changes of puberty. Hormones from the pituitary also cause a process to begin in one of the ovaries. An egg cell begins to mature inside a sac called a follicle that develops around it. As the egg cell and follicle grow, they move toward the outer surface of the ovary. There, the follicle breaks through the ovary and releases the egg cell into a tube. This process, called ovulation, occurs about once a month and usually occurs in one ovary 1 month and the other ovary the next. The tube the egg cell passes into is one of a pair of tubes called the fallopian tubes that extend from our ovaries to the uterus, or womb. When the follicle releases the egg cell, it also begins secreting a hormone that will cause changes in the lining of the uterus. This same hormone also stops the pituitary from producing the hormones that start egg cell development and follicle growth. And that pretty well guarantees that only one egg cell will be moving through our reproductive system at a time. The egg cell begins moving along the length of the uterine tube. The follicle it came out of will eventually undergo cellular changes and then be reabsorbed into the ovary. Each uterine tube is some 10 centimeters long, around 4 inches. These tubes are lined with two kinds of cells. One type produces mucus. The other type of cell has tiny hair-like cilia. Involuntary muscles in the walls of the uterine tubes set up wave-like movements in the cilia. These movements create fluid currents in the mucus, and the currents carry the egg cell toward the uterus. The trip takes about 3 days. When fertilization occurs, it usually takes place in one of these tubes. During this time, the uterus has begun responding to hormones from the ovary. The changes that take place in its lining are preparing it for the possibility of a fertilized egg. In the uterine lining, layers of cells have begun growing, and the lining is thickening. Blood vessels grow into this thickened area, bringing blood to nourish the new cells. If the egg cell is not fertilized during its trip through the uterine tube or shortly afterwards in the uterus, these changes are not needed. The cells that thickened the lining die and separate from the normal lining of the uterus. The tiny blood vessels that carried blood to these cells break and release a small amount of blood. Over a period of several days, the dead cells and blood are carried out of the uterus into the tube-shaped vagina and then eliminated from our bodies. This is the process of menstruation that occurs about every 28 days. Menstruation and ovulation make up what is called the menstrual cycle. Now the pituitary gland becomes active again. It begins secreting hormones that start the development of another egg cell in another follicle and start us into another menstrual cycle. Once again, our bodies are being prepared for the possibility that an egg cell will be fertilized by a sperm cell. And the function of the reproductive system of the male is to supply that sperm cell.
Hormones from the pituitary gland are also responsible for our physical and sexual changes at puberty. These hormones affect our primary sex organs, the testes. At puberty, which usually occurs sometime between the ages of 14 and 16 for us, hormones from the pituitary cause the testes to begin producing large amounts of a hormone called testosterone. It is this hormone that triggers our physical and sexual maturation. Our testes, which are commonly called testicles, are a pair of organs about the same size and shape as the woman's ovaries. Not only do they secrete hormones, but they also manufacture our reproductive cells, the sperm. The testes, unlike the ovaries, are suspended outside the main part of the body. Testes hang in a sac called the scrotum. Because they are out of the pelvis, the temperature of the testes is a few degrees below normal body temperature. This lower temperature is necessary for the production of healthy sperm. But too low a temperature is also not good for sperm development. So low temperatures will cause the involuntary muscles of the scrotum to contract. This wrinkles the wall of the scrotum, raising the testes up toward the warmth of the pelvis. Healthy sperm can develop only within a narrow range of temperature. Each testis is divided into sections that contain tubules, long coiled tubes, microscopic in diameter. In the lining of these tiny tubules, there is a layer of specialized cells that produce the sperm. Tens of millions of microscopic sperm cells are produced here each day in the mature male. Developing cells are pushed through the tubules as new cells develop behind them. The tubules carry the sperm out of the testes to a coiled tube some 20 feet long, more than 6 meters, where they are stored. In this storage tube, the sperm complete their development and gain the power to move by whipping their long tails. When sperm cells leave our bodies, they move through ducts past the bladder, which is not part of the reproductive system, and into the upper part of the urethra, which normally carries urine from the bladder. Here, the sperm cells mix with secretions from sacs called seminal vesicles and secretions from the prostate gland that the urethra passes through and form a substance called semen. The urethra extends through the penis, and it is through this organ that the semen, carrying the sperm cells, leaves the male body, usually forced out by spasmodic muscular contractions of the prostate gland and various ducts. These contractions close the connection between the bladder and the urethra, so that urine can't flow through it at the same time. During sexual intercourse, about 300 million sperm cells are in the semen that passes out of the male's reproductive system and into the reproductive system of the female.
Semen enters the female's body through the vagina. Whipping their long tails, the sperm cells swim from the vagina toward the uterus and the uterine tubes. Now, with male sex cells in the female body, fertilization of the egg cell becomes possible, but it must take place within a limited time. The sperm cells will live only about a day or two once they're inside our bodies, and an egg cell moving down the uterine tube will also live only about a day or two if it isn't fertilized. To become fertilized, an egg cell must be penetrated by a sperm cell. Only one of the 300 million has to do it. In fact, only one of the 300 million can do it, because as soon as penetration is accomplished, a chemical barrier is instantly set up in the membrane. Now, no other sperm cells can get through. The egg cell is fertilized. Up to now, 2 reproductive systems have been necessary to complete the first stage of the process of human reproduction, the fertilization of the egg cell by the sperm cell. The second stage, in which a fertilized egg develops into a new, unique human being, requires only the woman's reproductive system. But before we see that development, Let's take a closer look at these two tiny cells that began this new human life, the egg cell and the sperm cell, and see why the human being that will result from their union is unique. Sex cells differ from other cells in your body in a special way. They carry only half the number of chromosomes that cells usually carry. Chromosomes are the structures in a cell's nucleus that contain the genes, the units of heredity that carry all a person's genetic traits. A normal cell contains 46 chromosomes. And when this egg cell began its development, it also had 46 chromosomes. But as it matured, a small cell called a polar body separated from it, carrying away half of the 46 chromosomes in its nucleus. This left 23 behind in the nucleus of the egg cell. When the egg cell was finally mature, it still had only 23 chromosomes.
The sperm cell also started its development with a full number of chromosomes in its nucleus, 46. As it matured, it divided, and the chromosomes in its nucleus divided as well, but in such a way that each division of the sperm cell had only 23 chromosomes. Another division took place before the sperm cells matured, but this division also produced cells with 23 chromosomes. So the sperm cells, like the egg cells, each had half the usual number of chromosomes.
And when they united, the half set of chromosomes that each sex cell provided became a complete set of 46 chromosomes in the fertilized egg, carrying all the physical traits of the human being that will develop. Each parent contributed one set of chromosomes, but the laws of heredity will determine which genes will be dominant. Those genes that dominate will determine the resulting child's hair color and texture, eye color, mouth shape, nose shape, blood type, and all the other physical characteristics that make up a person. All this information is in the genes of the newly developing individual, plus the factors that will determine its sex.
Egg cells from the female contain only one type of sex-determining chromosome. This is usually called the X type. Our sperm cells can carry two types, either the X type that the egg cell carries, or a type that is called the Y type. Sperm cells that carry the X type result in female offspring. Those that carry the Y type result in male offspring. So it's our sex cells that determine the sex of the new organism.
If there is a fertilized egg in one of the uterine tubes, it begins dividing as it continues its trip toward the uterus. The membrane of the egg pinches inward, and now there are two attached identical cells. Once the dividing begins, it goes on continuously with more and more cells being formed. Usually within 10 days after it has been fertilized, this growing cluster of cells has reached the uterus and burrowed into the enlarged lining. Here it continues its growth. Two membranes have developed around this cluster of cells. One sends extensions into the uterus and will become the placenta and the umbilical cord. And the other, filled with fluid, will encase and protect the growing embryo.
And the embryo grows. Cells multiply and specialize. They begin differentiating into cells that will form different kinds of tissues, and the tissues in turn will form different organs. After about 2 months, most of the features and internal organs of an adult have developed. The heart is beating. Blood is circulating. But the baby's circulatory system is not connected with its mother's. Food and oxygen pass from the mother's blood through the placenta into the umbilical cord and then into the baby's circulatory system. And wastes from the baby pass out into the mother's circulatory system in the same way. One organism is growing inside another. A new individual is being formed. A human is being reproduced.
Some 9 months after a single tiny sperm cell fertilized a single tiny egg cell, a new individual made of trillions of cells is ready to begin life on its own. It is ready to be born. And not long after the birth of a child, our bodies begin the production of hormones again that renew our menstrual cycle and make another fertilization possible.
Each human life is a link in a great chain of life, stretching backward and forward in time, a chain kept unbroken by the reproductive systems of the male and female human body.